Martin, you've been with Eureka Street longer than anyone currently. Of all our writers, you're a fan favourite, and Eureka Street readers have said that they love your writing, and you've got a weekly column that ranges from these kind of deeply insightful reflections and analysis and applied theology and church history and social justice issues that is written in this really easily accessible kind of public language. Just to get us started, I was wondering whether you might be able to talk about your style and writing these pieces that deal with such complex concepts and making them widely accessible.
Well, I've always valued simple writing, straightforward writing, really, from when I was a schoolboy, really, which is when I first got interested in writing. I think I was edited the school newspaper, which needed to be pretty simple. But partly, I think, from studying ancient languages, Greek and Latin, getting interested in the way that words worked, that it had an ideal of saying things in as few words and as simple words as possible. And so I found that was quite helpful when I started writing more seriously afterwards. But I need to write. I need to write so that I can understand something, and I can only understand simple words.
Fantastic. I like that, writing to understand something. Learning this economy of language from Greek and Latin as well. That might not be something that readers know about you as well. Do you speak Greek and Latin fluently?
No, well, it's ancient Greek, and Latin is by definition an ancient language.
You've touched on this just then, but could you give a little bit of background to yourself and your dealings with Eureka Street? Like, when did you first write for Eureka Street? Because I know you've been on board the entire time. When did you first write for it? And do you remember what that piece was about?
Yeah, I was surprised to find, actually, I was in the first edition with a piece on Burmese refugees. This was fairly shortly after I think it was, so I remember shortly after the crackdown on, it was the crackdown on dissent, shortly after Aung San Suu Kyi came back she came back to Burma, as it was at that time, and students then supported her, and then the army had a very violent crackdown, and a great number of more students fled for the border into Thailand. I've met some of them through my work with JLS there.
We had a piece, wasn't on some Myanmar earlier on this year. Is it interesting to look at early pieces that you've written like that from 1991 and then comparing that to kind of what the global situation is like now, and kind of comparing and contrasting, see how much it changed or how little it's changed?
Yeah, well, I think that's reading through that first edition or first year of Eureka Street was quite enlightening, really, because so many of the issues which are current today actually featured in that first edition. There was, of course, Myanmar was one of them, refugees more generally, the refugee situation, because Jesuit Refugee Service had been founded not so many years before, but it was an emergency organisation to solve the refugee problem in the Horn of Africa and in Southeast Asia. And it was assumed that, that'd be 2 years' work or something, then we could get back to a life without refugees. Well, the situation now, of course, is far worse, but there are a number of other topics, though, which I was surprised to find in that first edition. There was the Murray Valley Basin, there was climate, there was inequality, and a number of other issues which have perhaps become much more central for us in our life today, in the national life today.
both good and bad news, I suppose, because it means that Eureka Street was very much on track, but also maybe that those issues haven't been resolved maybe as much as one might like. Do you remember what your initial thoughts of Eureka Street were?
I was delighted, I think, when we were doing something, but it was seeing the first edition, it was something totally different from what I'd imagined. That I think we'd taken over, Jesuits had taken over the editing of an Australian Catholic periodical to do with cultural periodical. So it dealt with matters of culture, not so much politics, but social topics of social justice and things like that, for 20th century. Something a little bit like perhaps like Quadrant, you might say, but with fairly long essays, and so it was for an audience of not exactly an academic audience, but for a serious audience, I suppose you might say. And that's what I visualised. I thought it'd be really great to have something like that. But when when I saw Eureka Street come out, and it had crosswords, and it had very short pieces here and long pieces there, and a tremendous range of topics and length of discussion. Real emphasis on the presentation of the magazine. Perhaps yes, it was a magazine rather than a journal. I think I really visualised it as a journal. But but seeing it took a few issues to work out what it was all about. But then I enjoyed it. You could write a lot. It was a lot of you could write in many different styles, and for it, I think I had 3 or 4 articles on cycling, which were rather playful articles, I suppose. Describing incidents that had happened when I was riding, and one of them, a bicycle caught fire. But when I was riding it, so stories like that were worth telling. Yes,
that's amazing. How just to recap? I mean, that's fascinating. How does a bike catch fire when you're riding it?
Well, I suppose it helps if you're in Scotland, because things like that happen in Scotland. So it's coming down a fairly steep hill, and the bicycle had a very unusual, the back hub was very unusual. It had a hub brake, but the gears were also in the hub brake. The gears were Sturmey Archer, which is, they rest in an oil bath. So in this hub, we've got an oil bath, but in fact, the brakes then are metal sleeve. So you've got a metal sleeve producing heat, and perhaps sparks shooting into an oil bath. And so the oil caught fire, I suppose, as we're going down. I think Brendan, my companion, swears that he saw flames jumping out of the bicycle. But
so just to, I think for some readers who, I mean, so some viewers who might not have a sense of how much you've been writing for Eureka Street over the years, you've been incredibly prolific. Looking back, if you had to estimate, how many pieces would you say you've written for Eureka Street?
I haven't a clue, to be quite honest. That early on, Eureka Street appeared in the printer version, appeared once a month, obviously, and I certainly wasn't in the every occasional, be a few times, sometimes a year, I'd be writing for it, as I remember anyway. But I think probably I started writing perhaps more often when we went online, because then we're running the 2 eventually, I think initially a couple of times a week, but then we moved to 2 articles, about 10 articles a week or so. So I think it was probably fairly, I'd imagine at that stage, fairly regular. But by that stage, I should say that I think I started writing much more when I became, I kept on teaching half-time, then I was asked to come to Jesuit Communications. I think initially I was called publisher, but that assumed you know something about publishing. So eventually it was just, I suppose, a Jesuit presence in some way in the magazine, and I became an editorial consultant, which means that everybody knows what a consultant is, but no one knows what a consultant does. So it's a very satisfactory title.
And it's not just for Eureka Street as well. You're writing for lots of other places at the same time, like you're writing for Australian Catholics, you're writing for Madonna magazine, you're writing for diocesan publications. And I found a piece where you previously stated in an article that from an early age, writing was in the blood, which I really like. What does your daily writing routine look like to be able to be that prolific?
I think it depends. It's become very different in lockdown, really. That my writing, I suppose, writing beforehand was coming to work and desperately trying to get some peace and quiet in where I was. Well, just focusing on writing and trying to avoid meetings and all sorts of other distractions from it. And then of course was the traffic to and fro from the office. So it was finding time when I could. I think since lockdown has actually been quite helpful from the writing point of view, purely from the writing point of view, because you can get up in the morning and that's what you do during the day. The challenges, you need break from writing, but you also need to have some. Your writing needs to have stimulus, stimulus from people, not simply from looking at other online magazines or reading newspapers and so forth. So it's to try and keep thinking, really, to find stimulus for thinking, perhaps thinking a little bit outside the circle, I guess. I think I'm fairly professional, actually, in some ways, in this, professional perhaps in the bad sense, but in that, to me, there's only two questions I ask myself about writing is how many words and when is it due? And once I've gone aware I've got a piece due, then I need to find a topic, and that pressure of finding a topic usually produces it. So doesn't usually so much from conversation. It's usually that I suppose subconsciously always looking for something. If somebody does something stupid or whatever, and you comment on that, or there's a crisis arises or whatever. So I suppose the eye is always looking for things, but sometimes though it's there's a book. Given a book which might form the basis of a review article or something. So on the whole, I've never found difficulty in really in topics seem to arise. It's very rarely that I get anxious that I haven't got something to write about. But also though but just a general conversation, say. The meetings of editors, people concerned with editing in the Jesuit Communications, well, those conversations throw up topics, and so sometimes they generate an article too. Yeah. It's a bit of a mystery, really. I don't. There's no system to it. It's just. I trust that the well is going to be water in the well when I need to dip the bucket in.
There always is.
Well, seems to be so far.
It's just on some of the pieces that you've written. I think your material seems to have contributed to creating the tone of Eureka Street, where the tenor of discussion is one of peaceful bridge building rather than just providing another breeding ground for online vitriol, say. yet without compromising on values. And I think that's a relatively difficult line to walk sometimes. Could you talk a little bit about that tone specifically, and just your intentions in when you're writing a piece like that, where it is very much about fostering that sort of discussion that Eureka Street exists to further, I suppose?
Yes, I suppose I do see Eureka Street as being about conversation, and conversation is not shouting at one another. But, so the conversation, spark conversation, it helps to start off with a fairly even tone, and to be posing a question rather than giving an answer. Immediately giving an answer, you may well be answering a question in it. That I would see is the ideal, and so I think the emphasis is very strongly on the argument that you're making, and that argument needs to be an open argument rather than something which simply bashes up the opposition, which is easier. I sometimes wonder if, number one, how serious I am about that. But number two, whether there's been some change in the attitude over the years, because I've written extensively on refugee issues, something I feel extremely strongly on. So I remember some of my earlier articles, some of them were splendidly angry articles, and I think I've moved. It became evident it's become evident in more recent years anyway that those articles were really appealing strongly to a committed group of people, and in that and that's a very useful. It's very helpful to be able to support people who are activists for good causes. So I can see the value in it, but equally, it also seemed to me that angry articles in which you demolish the opposition are more likely to strengthen. They will strengthen people in their original attitudes usually rather than change them. And there's more people who are hesitant about refugees or against them than there were for them. So it wasn't helpful even for the cause which I represented. So now now it's much better to try and find an angle in which people who hold to quite divergent sides of the same topic can both of them can find a way in without direct conflict, but it's something in it for both of them.
There's a few things there that strike me. One is that that you had previously written angry articles. I find that fascinating because just from what I read of yours now, that and the response for that was possibly not ideal, was kind of like a doubling down of people's position regardless of wherever they sat on the spectrum of that issue. Whereas now your writing is very invitational, and people respond to that really well. People do respond to your work because they've been reading it for 3 decades potentially, and so there is that relationship there with your readers. Do you think readers have been on that same journey as well, of going from being entrenched in a position to then becoming much more invitational and asking more questions about and much more kind of fostering dialogue as well?
I guess if you're looking over 30 years of readership, well then another way of describing that is the aging process, isn't it? And the aging process notoriously can make people either more broader, or it can make them more querulous. And so some people become, I think some people just become more, get more angry with age. Others probably do, probably manage, or can control their anger a little bit better anyway. I suppose not being angry, though, doesn't mean that you don't take strong positions either. That in fact, I think on most topics I do take really strong positions, but their strong position is argued from a fairly simple, I suppose it's a fairly simple core to it, and that is that it's the core of human dignity, that each human being is precious, and that's just, and but furthermore, human beings can only, human beings are made, we're social, and so we only thrive if we work together, and so you've got that. So that's spelled, I suppose, for me, that's it's spelled out certainly in it's called Catholic social teaching, but that they're fairly very simple insights. Those insights really I'm arguing from all the time, and arguing quite strongly for that. And this is a fairly minority position as far as in terms of policy making is concerned. It's a much more pragmatic business. So when I am taking a position, I'm aware of it, that there are people who are coming from quite different perspectives. But you can, in fact, it's the end does justify the means sometimes.
I was going to ask you as well, are there any kind of particular pieces that you've written about over the years that sort of stand out to you when you look back over all the writing you've done, particularly for Eureka Street? Are there any pieces that you think that one really stands out, or for whatever reason, whether it was kind of the right message at the right time, or people responded to it in a different way than they did usually?
Yeah, well, I suppose the brief answer to that is I never look back. So my only interest is in the next one. So it's so it's very, I find it very hard to remember what I've done in the past. I think I think probably some of the most pleasing actually have been in review articles when I don't think we really do reviews now. We used to do book reviews in the longer version of Eureka Street, but we do review articles, which means really the book is used to some extent. It's used to sparks a question, and it illustrates a wider question that you might be looking at. But I think, I suppose the articles, probably some ones I'd be happiest with is in that process where I feel I've really done justice. I feel I've done justice to the book, and I've never really known that though, unless you sometimes then either the publisher or the writer gets back saying that that's exactly what I was on about. Well, that's really satisfying.
And one other thing I was thinking as well, you've been instrumental in maintaining the literary tradition of Eureka Street, and supporting its poets and its poetry, and you yourself are an exceptional poet as well. I was wondering whether you might comment on that aspect of, firstly, your work and Eureka Street's role in publishing poetry and just being part of the Australian literary landscape.
I think it's very important to hang in there, and I would see that our poet, it's almost a symbol as much of anything else that the poetry is important. and that its culture and civilization really depend on imaginative writing, not simply on analysis. And so analysis is obviously what we're mostly about. And I think just to be able to provide a place where Australian poets can be published, even if it's a very small place, I think it's a contribution. It's not, we're not a major player, but I think it's an important contribution and affirmation of the importance of poetry in the society.
Well, I think we've covered basically most of the things I wanted to discuss today. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that that would be pertinent to a discussion of your involvement in Eureka Street's journey that sort of needs mention?
So I think it's been, I've just seen it as just helping, as other writing really. It's just helping the magazine along. It's I believe what we're doing, I think, is important, and but I see myself just very much a servant in that work and in that contribution.